I want to again address the question of would God use evidence, because that's a big one. It comes up a lot, and I think it's very important to look at the biblical narrative of as recorded in John chapter 20 verses 1 through 9. Now, if you read the scripture, it says that Mary goes to the tomb, sees that the stone has been rolled aside from the entrance, and she sees that the body is gone. And she goes to find Simon Peter and John, and she says, quote, "Someone or they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they've put him." Now, she thinks that the body is stolen. Now, who's they? Now, she's either referring to either the Romans or the Jews, because she's going to tell the apostles that the body's gone. So Peter and John run down to the tomb. John gets there first and waits for Peter. Peter finally gets there. Now he goes inside that tomb and sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes inside. He also notices the cloth lying there and believed that he had risen. Well, my goodness, that's a big difference. Mary thinks the body's stolen because she doesn't see the cloth. She just sees that there's no body there. Peter and John go inside that tomb. Both of them see the cloth lying there, and their first reaction is something as extraordinary has occurred here. And I mean, now there are a couple theories as to what they may have seen. Think of the body laid out on the stone sepulcher, which is a kind of a slab of rock in the back of the tomb, maybe a foot off the ground, and the body would have been lying there, wrapped in this burial shroud, just the same way it was put there on Friday. Everything there undisturbed, no difference except there's no body, even perhaps with strips of linen bound around the outside of the cloth. Now that might make you think that something extraordinary had occurred. Now, conversely, if you saw that cloth balled up and thrown into a corner, well then sure, someone probably stole the body. So I think the first clue for Peter and John that something extraordinary had happened was specifically related to the burial shroud. In fact, it was the burial shroud itself, which is the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. So when we ask ourselves, would God use evidence? Well, he left a vacant burial shroud and he left an empty tomb, which are certainly the two clear evidences. Now, right before Jesus was sentenced to be executed, he performed this amazing miracle, and most of you probably know it. It's the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, Lazarus was a friend, and Jesus knew that he was dying and knew that he in fact had already died, and he deliberately waited several days before he arrived at the tomb. So it had been 4 days that Lazarus had been dead. And he says, "Lazarus, come forth." And out walks Lazarus, and the scripture says, wearing his grave clothes, bound hand and foot. Now, this is very interesting. Lazarus was raised back up to normal life, the kind of life that you and I are living right now. But Jesus left his burial shroud on that stone sepulcher. So whatever happened to Jesus is entirely different from what happened to Lazarus. And that's very important. And I'm going to talk about Lazarus again in just a minute, about the significance of Jewish burial practices. But I want to stay on this question of would God use evidence? Because another verse of Scripture we find from Acts chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "After his suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive." Obviously, we're talking about post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, but one of those proofs was certainly, for Peter and John at least, was that vacant burial shroud. Another verse of Scripture I find very interesting too, in terms of the question, would God use evidence? In John chapter 14, verse 10, he says this. Now this is Jesus speaking. "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves." What is he saying? He's saying if you cannot believe who I am based on what I tell you, then at least believe on the evidence of the miracles that you see. And of course, the greatest of all miracles was the resurrection. Now, curiously, the resurrection is the only miracle that had no eye witnesses. Every other miracle Jesus performed, whether it was feeding the multitude or raising Lazarus or walking on the water, calming a storm, healing the blind, all these miracles were public for everyone to see and behold that this man truly must be the Son of God. Now, the greatest miracle, this transformative miracle that occurred in the tomb, had no eyewitnesses. Yet we do have a witness. And the witness is the burial shroud that wrapped him in the tomb, that Peter and John saw lying there on the stone sepulcher. Now, is the Shroud of Turin that very same cloth? I don't know. I think it could be. There's a lot of evidence that would support it. The problem, of course, if you're going to build that kind of a case, is, you see, I don't think that Peter and John saw images on the linen shroud. I'm not even that. It could have been years later before anyone found images on a linen shroud. And now, why is that? Because I think this thing was probably folded up, thrown into an urn or some kind of a container. And for the Jews, this was a particularly troublesome issue because it contained blood. It touched a corpse. It is unclean. And so now here's the conundrum. Well, wait a minute. Jesus was dead, but now he's not. So is this clean or is it unclean? I don't even think the first century Jewish apostles or the believers of Jesus knew what to do with it. It's not likely that they were out, showing the shroud off as saying, here's proof that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't think so, because among the Jews, again, it would have been considered unclean. So I think the discovery of images on this linen shroud perhaps came later, perhaps even much later. But the question is this: how far back in time does the idea of Jesus's image on his linen cloth, how far back in time does that go? Now, interestingly, it goes back at least 1,500 years. In fact, there's liturgy that is used by a sect of Byzantine Catholics that operate in Spain today. It's called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week, and they translate this verse of scripture this way. It says, Peter and John saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. The recent imprints? That's not in scripture, but that liturgy goes back 1,500 years. Does it go all the way back to first century? I don't know. But again, back to this whole issue of evidence, the empty tomb. Yes, it was the empty tomb, but more specifically, it was the linen cloth lying there that was the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. So, does God use evidence? Apparently, he does.